Hello, and welcome to Sara and Mattie's awesome Lichen podcast. I'm Sara Ford.
And I'm Mattie McCune.
And this podcast is about the wonderful world of lichen in the Pacific Northwest. Throughout this podcast, we will be exploring just a fraction of the wide world that lichens have to offer. First, Mattie will start by explaining the basics of lichen, their structure, and how they are so different from any other kind of plant. She will also focus on the genera of the Pacific Northwest, which are particularly interesting. Next, I'll explain some of the basic tips on how to identify lichens and some common species that you will find in the Pacific Northwest, as well as best practices if you want to collect some lichen for yourself. Then, Mattie will explain some of the unique properties of lichen that make them so important to the environmental conservation and our ecosystem. Finally, we will sit down with an expert in the field, Dr. Hanna Prather, where she will explain her work with lichens and what she sees as the future of lichen ecology.
So, what exactly is a lichen? And what makes it different from moss or algae? Well, we can start off with what they're not. They are not plants. Lichens are their own mini ecosystems. They are made up of two different organisms that combine into one. Their fungal component, known as the mycobiont, provides the structure of the organism. The photobiont is the component that photosynthesizes, providing food for the organism, and is either cyanobacteria, algae, or both. There are only a few different photobionts, but a plethora of mycobionts that form lichen, which is why the name of the lichen refers to the fungal component of the lichen. Lichen can thrive in some of the harshest environments, from extreme cold to extremely dry conditions. The Pacific Northwest is an especially unique place to look for lichen, as it includes more than 1,500 different species.
Identifying and collecting lichen species is no easy feat and requires some basic understanding of the common locations, substrates, which refers to what surfaces lichens can grow on, and common growth patterns. Lichens in the Pacific Northwest are found everywhere, from alpine mountains to rocky beaches. The more remote the location, the more rare lichen you are likely to encounter, but there are plenty of lichens growing on trees in heavily populated areas. Common substrates for lichen are branches and trunks of trees, especially those with harder wood, rock, and even man-made substrates like concrete or even the occasional lamppost. Lichen have three distinct growth patterns: foliose, fruticose, and crustose. Lichens look vastly different depending on that kind of growth pattern. Foliose lichen are three-dimensional, with no clear distinction between their upper and lower surfaces, and they generally can be described as bushy, stringy, or pendulous. These are the lichen that are most commonly confused for moss. Fruticose lichen are generally considered leaf-like and are more two-dimensional, but stick out to the substrate. Crustose are, as expected, crust-like, and stick to the substrate almost completely and are two-dimensional. Lichens come in many colors, from pale greens and grays to bright oranges and yellows, and even some black lichen exist. Common lichen, however, will often be a kind of pale green-gray. Some common foliose lichen in the Pacific Northwest are Auvernia prunastri and Ramalina ferencea, which you can find on many branches of hardwood trees. Auvernia and Ramalina have pale green branches centering on one central point attached to the substrate. Other common genera often found in the Pacific Northwest include Usnea, which grow long, thin branches like those commonly associated with Spanish moss, and Xanthoria, which have distinct orange cups. If you encounter a branch on the ground with lichen attached, best practice tells us to take that lichen over the one that is attached to a living substrate. In this way, you aren't harming the lichen that has the potential to keep growing. If you want to collect a crustose lichen, bring a pocket knife along with you to remove the lichen from its substrate.
So, what is a lichen's ecological role? Lichen are considered indicator species, but what does that mean? An indicator species is any biological species that defines a trait or characteristic of the environment. To break this down a little further, lichens, along with other indicator species, can be monitored in their abundance and their population levels to reflect overall biodiversity. Well, why do lichen do this? As the National Park Service puts it, lichen are sensitive to atmospheric pollution such as nitrogen because they receive all their nutrients and water from wet and dry atmospheric deposition. Nitrogen deposition can increase the load of nutrients. Too much nitrogen can harm and kill the algae's chlorophyll, which is used to produce sugars, feeding it and the fungi. Certain species of lichen are more tolerant of nitrogen than others. That means that when an increase in nitrogen-tolerant species or a decrease in nitrogen-sensitive species occurs, this may indicate an increase in atmospheric nitrogen deposition. Therefore, a shift in their species composition and/or their health exemplifies the potential beginning of ecosystem decline due to nitrogen deposition. Lichen are a keystone species in many ecosystems. They serve as a food source and a habitat for many animals, such as deer, birds, and rodents. They provide nesting materials for birds, and they protect trees and rocks from extreme elements such as rain, wind, and snow. As of right now, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website lists 3 species of lichen as endangered. Although most lichen aren't endangered, it's still wise to take smaller samples and be conscious of what you're sampling if you want to study lichen yourselves.
So now we are excited and honored to introduce lichen expert Hanna Prather to the podcast. Hanna has her PhD in plant and community ecology from Portland State University and is currently teaching at Reed College. Her research in lichen ecology has taken her around the globe, from the tops of trees in Portland, Oregon, to the harsh polar climates of Antarctica. Hanna, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, great. So we'll first start off, can you give us some background into your career more generally, and then your experience with lichens more specifically? How did you come to research lichens in the first place?
Yeah, what a great question, and hard to synthesize how this love of lichens has come to be. My research career, I guess I would say, well, I guess I could start even farther back. I grew up in a really rural town in southern Oregon, and I grew up on a tree farm, so I always have kind of been outside and had a lot of comfort being outside. My dad was a tree farmer, grew Douglas fir seedlings, so I grew up on a tree nursery, in fact. So when I went to college, I think I'm the youngest of my family, so I'm kind of the free spirit, kind of had a hard time figuring out what I wanted to do, kind of wanted to change my major a bunch of times. But really, I knew I was connected strongly with nature and particularly with trees. And so that drew me to pursue natural resources and forestry undergraduate at Oregon State. And so that really got some of my basis, right, in that type of outdoor and science field. But after that, it really took some time before I fell in love with lichens. I worked a little bit between graduate school, and I had done a number of field surveys outside, everywhere from spotted owl to sort of forest inventory type of work, a lot of time outside in rugged conditions. And then I turned towards urban forestry, actually. I moved to Portland, and I started becoming really interested in the forests within our cities. And during that time, I learned how to climb trees. And when I was climbing trees, I was noticing all of this biota that I knew nothing about up high in these canopies. And so some of that spurred me towards wanting to pursue graduate school. I knew where I was at with my career in science was a lot of seasonal work, and so it was hard to feel like I could really make much momentum forward career-wise unless I went back to graduate school. So then I ended up in a program at Portland State, and through some navigating of that, ended up working in a lab that studied plant physiology and particularly mosses. And so it was with my PhD advisor, who's a wonderful human and a great friend, and through his support to kind of encourage me to pursue something really different that the lab wasn't studying, that I decided to start looking at lichens in urban tree canopies. And so that was kind of the premise of my PhD work.
Oh, that's really wonderful. So, I'll ask you some questions about lichen research and kind of the current field, because as you said, it's not very common, and I'm really interested in how big is this field of lichen research? Are there any common misconceptions about it? Some generalizations made about it that you want to kind of address potentially?
Yeah, good question. So the field of lichenology, I think, is fairly small. Yeah. You could probably very quickly, when you start in this realm, you learn that you start to learn everybody. You start to know everybody pretty quickly. And there's kind of two camps of people. There's a lichenologist and the bryologists who study mosses. And lichens and mosses often grow together. So you're seeing these communities a lot together. But there are kind of two camps of people generally how it falls out, even though there's a lot of overlap and interest in both groups. But I would say if you went to a lichenology conference, it would be fairly small, and that could be everyone from the globe.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of broader parts to it too, everywhere from studying taxonomy to more ecological questions. So I think that adds a lot more diversity to the field as well. Sorry, could you prompt me on your other part of that question?
Yeah, what I'm actually interested in is, do you like how small that field is? Do you find that kind of appealing rather than a kind of more general, a lot of people contributing to this kind of field?
Yeah, good question. I think for me it's worked really well. I don't think I knew much when I started how small it would be, but it's been a really wonderful community of people who have a lot of support. And I felt really highly encouraged by all of the lichen folks I had met early on who were just really gracious and helpful to me in learning lichens and letting me use their herbarium to learn about different species and helping me out when I was stuck trying to look at things. So it's a very wonderful community. But I guess for me too, I've ended up in science that's been in pretty niche fields. So my other prong of research has been in Antarctica, which is also a fairly select field. So I don't think I know it too much, a different way and to be in a broader category. But I think the niche fields are really fun to be a part of.
Yeah, that's great. So I'll just kind of move on here. What are the most rarest or most interesting lichen that you found in your research? And if you can specify that to the Pacific Northwest, I know your work in tree canopies might come in here.
Yeah, good question. So in my work, I didn't really encounter anything super rare, probably from the locales that I studied in. And a lot of my work has been centered around understanding urban tree canopies. But I can say that my favorite rare lichen is Pseudocyphalaria rainiarensis. I've never seen it. It's becoming increasingly more hard to find from what I hear, and particularly there's some questions about its sensitivity with climate right now. So places where it's been recorded, people have gone back and haven't been able to find it. But that would be the lichen of my dreams, the lichen I really want to see one day.
Can you describe that lichen a little bit for us? The different components, is it cyanobacteria, is it algae?
Yeah, it's a beautiful cyanolichen. It's large and foliose. I believe it has more of like a yellowy green coloration instead of gray-green. But it is often in canopies, but where it's found, it's just not abundant. So there'll be like a detection of it, but there's not a high abundance of it around to see.
Awesome. Great. So I'll turn now to a little bit of your current projects that you're working on at the moment, lichen or not. What are those current projects that you're working on that you're excited about, and what is your favorite part of the research process in that particular case?
Ooh, good questions. So yeah, my PhD work, I had mentioned, started with lichens in tree canopies and really trying to understand how canopy communities shift with changing urbanization. And then I had a prong of my work that took me to Antarctica, where we were studying mosses under warming to kind of ask some basic ecology about what mosses are there, very species-specific functional roles, and some of those dynamics. But since then, I've done a postdoc, which started here at Reed, just before the pandemic started. And that work has been really exciting as well. It's incorporated my tree climbing skills, but I'm actually studying the trees themselves now, not the things that are growing on the trees. So my postdoc work has been looking at hydraulic traits of native tree species. So I've looked at 3 native tree species in the Northwest, which are bigleaf maple, western red cedar, and Douglas fir. And I've asked questions about how they may adapt their hydraulic traits to climate change. And so this is a really cool way at looking at the physiology of these trees, very closely the little cells that move water, and asking questions like if you can adjust quickly, if you can, and I should mention too, these are the xylem cells, so these are grown every year. So if you can adjust those cells quickly to their changing climate, you might fend really well in a changing climate in a future forest. If you're a little slow and lagging to adjust those cells, you may not function very well in a future forest. And so that work had a prong of tall trees as well. Tall trees have some hypotheses around if they're more susceptible to drought with the increased travel of water, the path length. So there's a couple prongs in there, but basically what we found from that work are that trees respond in different ways with those hydraulic traits, and there is some suggestion that some of our native tree species may really struggle under future climates.
It's really super interesting.
Yeah. Oh, and then I think you had a bit about what parts of research.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing because I think I was someone who came into a PhD always kind of feeling like I didn't belong there. And so, but as I've stayed in research, I've really found that like the process of research is so fun and attractive to me. And the parts of research I think that are really wonderful are that there's a freedom and ability to keep asking new questions, and there's always challenges to kind of workshop and brainstorm through, and it never has to be the same thing over and over again, and you often can apply different questions into different ecosystems or use a different set of tools. And so for me, it's just been a really wonderful place to land, because I think I would become really bored if I was in a career where I couldn't always be asking a different question or just really have a lot of inherent curiosity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that sometimes gets missed in the way that we present science, and we're trained in science, is that it actually is a lot of curiosity and creativity. And so those are the things that keep me coming back for more.
That's so awesome. Yeah, I love that. So you mentioned kind of environmental impacts, which kind of leads us to our next question about current issues facing lichen or lichen research. Are there gaps in current literature where more research needs to be done for lichen? Are you concerned about the threats of climate change when it comes to lichen? Kind of what does the future look like?
Yeah, great question. And I think this could look different depending on which researcher you ask, right? Mm-hmm. Which prong of lichenology of interest in. I think for me right now, the pressing questions are around intensifying drought and wildfire in the West, and the loss of some of our really special ancient forests that have had a lot of lichen biodiversity. So I think there's some really big gaps in understanding the recolonization and kind of with this intensifying fire, like what we can anticipate. If lichen species need to be listed, if we need to be thinking about moving lichens around to help some of those populations persist. I think there's also some interesting questions around the symbiosis of lichens itself and sort of heat tolerance and climate change questions. We don't know a lot about things like vapor pressure deficit, which are really important for vascular plants like trees. And we know that that's increasing with climate change, but we don't understand really how that will affect lichens. But we anticipate with their poikilohydric lifestyle that could have some pretty devastating impacts for them.
Very good to know, thanks. So kind of as we kind of wrap up here, what are some good resources for those who are interested in learning about lichens but have little experience? Some potential research that people could go out and like their kind of first dip into kind of lichens in general.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's a good question. I wish there was more accessible ways for people to learn about lichens. One of the ways I started was through a workshop. So sometimes folks can find these. The Northwest Lichenologist is a group that has a webpage that's good to check. They often have local forays or sometimes workshops on different genera or just lichens themselves. But that was a great way for me to kind of dive in and understand the community and meet some others that were interested. Apart from that, if you have a chance to take a lichenology course, that would be awesome, but they're not really that offered super often in colleges now. But that would be a great place to do a deep dive. Beyond that, there's a lot of great resources online. There's some really fun YouTube resources that people could check out to get some good info on lichens. The books I like are the Lichens book by Purvis, which is now out of print, but is a super fun one that you can find digitally. And then in our region, the Macrolichens of the Pacific Northwest is a great guide as well by Bruce McCune, and there's a new third edition coming out soon. So I think those are kind of the best ways. It is a little bit of an obscure field, so it can be hard to find like lots of lectures or things like that, but occasionally you can find a lichen hike or a lichen walk put on like by a local arboretum or garden or something like that. That would be fun.
Cool. Awesome. Mattie, do you have any questions or follow-ups that you want to ask?
Yeah, I had 2 questions. My first one was, let's say that someone wanted to go into the field of lichen research. Based on your experience, is there advice that you have or experiences that you have that you wish maybe you could impart wisdom on like potential, future lichenologists?
Oh my gosh, good question. with lichens in particular, I would just say lichens are so fun and beautiful and fascinating that I think once you get the bug, it's kind of hard to not just adore them. And there's some of them that are just so cute and fun to look at. It never really gets tiring. But I think as far as general career advice, I think definitely, always paying attention. I think natural history skills are really important. Sometimes things that we haven't been learning as recently, but just kind of that ability to make observations simply is a really important component of crafting your own research question and just observing biota and being able to notice little changes and things like that. But I think the field as a whole is a wonderful place to land. There's so many questions to ask about lichens still, even though they're really ancient symbiosis. And the community is just a really fun one of very eclectic people. So I think as a whole, it'd be a great line to choose.
Nice. And then another question I would have is, I know that recently in your class, we got the opportunity to do lichen dyeing, which was really an awesome and fun experience. And so I guess I want to give you an opportunity to maybe discuss the fun opportunities that lichen have to offer, or the niche parts of lichen that maybe people aren't necessarily aware of.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah, I think the things that I've been really interested in, of course, the lichen dyeing, and I think there's also some methods to do pigment extraction or preparation to do painting, which I would love to learn more of, but I haven't tried that yet. Some lichens are edible, and some indigenous groups in our area used to use them as a forage source, so I think that would be really fun to play with the preparation like that. But I think... I still have kind of this fun idea of if you could use lichen pigments, create lichen pigments, and then paint actual lichens through your observation, I think would be an amazing class to spend a day doing. Other than that, I just enjoy them so much, but also most of them are best observed in their natural environment. So definitely harvesting and things like that should be done with caution or just with education to know what you're taking and where. But I think I just appreciate them so much for their unique qualities that alone is really fun for me.
Fantastic. And then I'd say my final question would be, with all this in mind, are there any ethical or conservational things that people should be aware of or cautious of in their own sampling or research of lichen?
Yeah, I think some of the keys with lichen sampling is always kind of bringing in that educated sense of what you're looking for and where, and what if you know that some things are rare, you could have an eye to make sure you don't accidentally take something like that. And they are fungi, but they are a little bit different than mushrooms in that when you harvest them, there's not a mycelial bit that stays behind in the environment. You're actually taking the full body of it. So just having some mindfulness of what's abundant and what isn't, and so which ones to practice more caution with when you find them. But a great place to harvest them is also from downed limbs or things that are on the ground, things that have blown out of trees, or of course firewood, things that will be used for a different purpose that you might be able to harvest from, and kind of limiting your harvest off of things that are standing or fixed on branches or on trees so that you're not disrupting that community by just ripping the little lichen from there. For conservation, I think we're still learning a lot about how persistent some of these species will be. Like we said with the wildfire questions, are we losing some of our rarest lichens? Those are questions that we still don't know, or if we really need to start to maybe have a helping hand with some of those species and protections too. So I think there's a lot we're going to learn on that in the next couple of years probably.
So now you might be wondering, how can you help? Or how can you do research yourself? You can submit entries to iNaturalist.com. This can help researchers track and study the lichen, their distribution, and potential changes in ecosystem processes and services in urban and natural environments. So if you want to participate in the research of lichen and experience the wonderful world of lichen for yourself, we implore you to go out and start identifying and recording species. Just make sure that any collection of species isn't damaging the environment or removing a rare species from its home. As John Muir says, take only pictures, leave only footprints, kill only time. Well, thank you so much for listening to Sara and Mattie's awesome Lichen podcast. I am Mattie McNeil.
And I'm Sara Ford.
For further information and to see the sources used for this podcast, feel free to check the description of the video.